The cold night revealed a dark road, briefly illuminated by a partial moon. The cloud seemed to shift its light as they slowly passed a ways off overhead. The road looked familiar, but I wasn't exactly sure of its name. I don't recall how I got here or why I was walking alone, but now wasn't the time to question my surroundings. For some inexplicable reason, this all felt familiar, but I wasn't sure why. I began to walk faster as the feelings of dread and unease began to grip firmly on my mental state. In front of me slowly appeared a figure. At first it was hard to see, but the closer it came, I slowly made the features of a young woman who wore a white nightgown that reflected what little the moon had to offer. She looked to be around my age. Her blonde hair was flowing in the cool night air. Her green eyes beamed at me, causing me to lock in on them. I approached slowly. I slowly began to see the features of the woman, her appearance slowly shifting from the majestic lady I just saw moments before. Her skin began to scar. A dark liquid slowly came from her eyes and mouth. Her face was not that of pain, but of indifference, staring at me blankly as her body slowly transitioned to that of a decayed injury. I tried to step back, but I was frozen in place. Terror filled my mind as she glided towards me, her eyes now hollow and dead, staring into my quivering soul. Her face was now mere inches from mine as she whispered, "It waits." I shot up out of bed and was out of breath. My wet shirt gripped my skin as my sheets were covered with sweat. It took me a few moments to realize I was back in my bed and not on that lonesome road. Even then, I needed a minute to calm myself. The nightmare had gripped me so tightly that even being awake and processing my empty room, I still felt uneasy. My subconscious mind was still letting me know that danger was still present, but I knew I was alone. I looked to my nightstand and saw my old pistol I had purchased years ago but never used, still sitting within arm's reach. My phone sat next to it charging while emitting a soft green, displaying the time. I closed my weary eyes and rubbed my face, my hands still damp from the night terror. I grabbed my phone and typed in the code without thinking. No notifications. The screen showed the time and date, Thursday, 6:43 a.m. I worked a half day today since I had my therapy appointments on Thursdays. I preferred Fridays, but Dr. Wilcox was full that day. I could have gone back to bed since I didn't have to work for another 2 hours, but I got up anyways. I took the handful of assorted medicine I had on my nightstand and held them in my hand as I searched for my water bottle. The images of last night's stream faded from my tired memory. I don't remember how I got on that road or why I was there, but I saw the woman in white again. I had seen her before. I mentioned it to Dr. Wilcox. He thinks that she represents my buried need to find a girlfriend, but I'm not sure. At first I thought the same, but each time I see the woman, she deteriorates more and more. Although last night's dream was horrifying, it was the first for me. Normally the woman is silent and stares at me, but last night she finally spoke. I pondered briefly what she said and what it could have possibly meant. What's waiting? I wondered. I got up and got dressed for the day. I put on my dirty uniform and put a t-shirt in my work bag for after. I'll do the laundry later tonight when I get back. I had time to kill, so I decided to make some breakfast for once. A rare delicacy I normally skip. My medicine makes it hard for me to have an appetite, but the side effects hadn't kicked in yet. I got halfway through breakfast before feeling the subtle discomfort of nausea. I saved the rest of breakfast for later, although I know I wasn't going to eat it. I left my apartment and entered the enclosed hallway of my apartment building, bracing myself for the day. I grabbed my keys to lock my door when I saw a strange yet familiar piece of paper taped to my door. It was a piece of copier paper with sharp and grotesque symbols covering its surface. The red and black ink was intricate, although visible errors were hardly noticeable. This was the 9th piece of paper with the exact image that had been taped to my door, at least the 9th one that I had kept. There were dozens other that I had thrown away before realizing that I should probably be keeping these as evidence. Just about every day for the last month, I would find a new paper waiting for me outside my apartment door. For whatever reason, each time I saw the new paper, a slight sense of unease deposited itself in my subconscious. Although the symbols and images were unknown to me, they were somehow offensive to me, and I registered a completely new feeling of malice. I took the paper, went back inside, placing it in my folder I kept by the fridge. I had many theories as to what was happening, but I couldn't be sure. The most harmless conclusion I could come up with was that someone was playing a prank on me, or had the wrong apartment number, but those concepts seemed most unlikely. The more nefarious reasons were that someone had it out for me, and either they knew me personally or picked me at random to inflict whatever they thought doing something like this to me would do. If their objective was to annoy me, it was working. I left my apartment again and drove the 23 minutes to work. Normally I would listen to music, but last night's dream had lingered longer than most. I felt the need to process it more in silence as I drove. I pulled into the gas station and put on my work hat. The nice thing about managing this low country gas station was that most people were nice and just wanted their gas. Very rarely did I have any conflicts that I needed to resolve. Gary, my coworker, greeted me with a toothy grin as I walked in the automatic doors. "Morning, boss," he said cheerfully as I walked past him on the way to the back room. "Hey, Gary," I said, doing my best to pretend that life wasn't going downhill. Gary was a nice older man. I interviewed him a couple of months ago as a gas station attendant, and he'd been fantastic. He was divorced and had a small criminal record, but having gotten to know him more and giving him a chance to rebuild his life had earned me his utmost respect. Frankly, I just needed a body to work the register throughout the week, but he has proven himself as invaluable since starting. "Another hard night?" he said, chuckling. This would normally shock me, but this was just something he said to people normally. Probably because I never got much sleep to begin with. "Yeah, I'm good," I replied, as I grabbed an energy drink from the mini fridge we kept next to the safe. The station was as busy as you would expect a small gas station to be in the morning. Just a handful of customers pumping gas outside, with one or two coming in to use the bathroom. "So, you got any plans tonight?" he asked as he was filling in the snack stand. I have a doctor's appointment in a couple of hours, but after that I found an interesting geocache online that's just on the other side of town I might go look at." Gary had stopped stacking and looked over to me. "Geocache? Is that where you look for rocks?" No. A geocache is where someone hides a trinket or something of value and gives you various clues to go and find it. Kinda like a watered-down scavenger hunt. Huh. That actually sounds really cool. What about you, Gary? What do you got going on? I could see his smile lessen briefly. Well, Kira was going to come over tonight, but she wanted to stay with her mom so she could go to her friend's birthday party. Gary had mentioned Kira briefly before, but I assumed it was just his girlfriend. Given the new context, I now realized it was his daughter. I didn't know how to respond. "Oh, I'm sorry. Kids don't know how good they have it." "Yeah, the older they get, the less they want to see you. I was the same way as a teen, so I can't blame her." Before I could respond, a customer came in. A middle-aged lady with big glasses, asking for $20 on pump 4. Gary chatted her up while I went in the back and got the schedule ready for the week. I spent the next couple of hours manning the register as I assisted Gary in restocking the liquor. The store was plenty slow, so we just bullshitted the whole shift. Gary told me about his conspiracy theories he'd been researching, how the government knew about aliens, and how they were helping them breed with our species. Alright, Gary, I thought to myself. I played along and made sure to keep the conversation work appropriate when the seldom customer would come in. Gary was kind of weird like that, always talking about nonsense that would never affect him in any meaningful way, but you gotta hand it to the guy. He worked like a horse. I checked the time and saw I needed to go to my appointment. "Gary, are you good if I leave for a lunch break?" I already knew the answer, but asked out of politeness. "Yeah, boss. Grab something good." I obviously wasn't eating lunch, but I didn't want him knowing I was seeing my shrink about my mental health. I didn't want to show weakness to those under me. I left the gas station and walked around back to the employee parking. A startling sight waited for me on my old Tacoma. Sitting on the windshield underneath the wiper was another paper. This was the first time I had one on my truck. Whoever this was not only knew where I lived, but what I drove and where I worked. It was clear that this wasn't a joke anymore. I couldn't write this off as anything else but targeted. I took the paper and got in my truck. I drove the 15 minutes across town and arrived at my appointment. My therapist's office was on the basement level of an old brick building. Above it was an empty office space that would frequently have different businesses trying to occupy it. I walked down the concrete steps and went into the office. The front desk was empty, with "Be back in 20 minutes" sign sitting on the receptionist's desk that had been there for at least a year. I could hear faint white noise coming from one of the back rooms. The smell of cheap, relaxing candles tried to mask the moldy smell of a wet basement office, creating a very unique scent that I didn't care for. Warm, dull colors gave the room a slight sense of optimism, but I was so overwhelmed with my dreams and constant dread that it had a little effect on me. Dr. Wilcox walked out with his previous patient. Her eyes were still red from their session, but she put on a weak smile as she said goodbye and ignored me while walking out of the office. He looked over to me and smiled. "Hayden, you ready?" His soft eyes rested on me as I got up and approached him. "I suppose," I responded. I enjoyed therapy. I really did. But like everything that is worthwhile, it can be hard at times. We sat in his office and he turned down the white noise. I had made mention to him several visits back that I didn't care for the added noise, and he has remembered ever since. "So, what's going on this week?" he asked to kick off our session. I paused, dreading the answer. A brief silence filled the room as I answered. I dreamed of her again. I thought I was getting better, I really did. I couldn't look at him as I sighed. Dr. Wilcox readjusted in his seat, prepping himself for a lengthy session. I can't remember her face. I never can, but I remember her. How she makes me feel. As if at one point I had known her. Like she meant something meaningful to me, but all that goes away and is replaced by dread and horror. Dr. Wilcox nodded. "You have mentioned her before. This time she's different. She's changed. She morphed into something terrible, her body scarring and broken in horrible ways. I don't know what any of that means." We fell silent. I racked my brain as I began to remember a crucial detail. She spoke to me, I think. It was along the lines of something waiting, but I'm not sure what she was referring to. Well, I think this could be a number of things. It could simply be just a bad dream. I know our minds tend to conjure thoughts and images that we're familiar with to manifest things to us. It could also be sexual frustration. I know that it's common for most guys, but I'm interested in hearing what you think it might be. I considered mentioning the papers. I was tempted into going into a long conversation about connecting the papers to my dreams, as if the papers themselves were causing them, but that was a subject for another time. A scab I didn't quite yet want to peel. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It doesn't help that I do watch a lot of horror," I said with a sigh. Dr. Wilcox relaxed, relieved that I was willing to change the subject. "I think I know what you need. You need social interaction. I think you need a healthy distraction rather than being all alone all the time. My homework for you is to find one person to hang out with before our next session. I think this will help you take your mind off things for once." I smiled as I got up. "Yeah, I can do that. I might invite a coworker to go geocache with me." Dr. Wilcox nodded. "That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm sure anyone would love to go with you." The rest of the session we talked about other topics like work and other areas for me to work on. Dr. Wilcox did a good job of making me feel worthwhile, almost as if we were friends, but I knew deep down that that wasn't true. I left the office with a brief sense of accomplishment. I was determined to feel better. I drove home as a soft rain cloud began to form. A slight pitter on my windshield was oddly relaxing. The pleasant day darkened as I drove home. For once, I was relieved to see that my door was bare. No ominous paper taped to its exterior. I went inside and decided how I wanted to spend my evening. I wanted to go out. I didn't have any friends per se, but I didn't want to spend the night just cooped up in my apartment, thinking about my problems. I went into my office and considered playing video games, but remembered seeing a geocache online that was located in my area. "That's right," I whispered. I pulled up the website and quickly found a cache on the other side of town. Typically, most caches have ratings of difficulty and reviews, which some have clues to help, but this one appeared to be new. It was posted last week and didn't have any reviews. I checked the time and saw it was close to 5 o'clock. I had a notification from Gary that he sent me a YouTube video for one of his conspiracy theories. I ignored the message, but an idea came to me. I dialed up Gary and he answered almost immediately. "Hello," he said in his usual optimistic tone. I invited him to come geocaching with me tonight, seeing how he was also going to be home alone. It was out of my nature to invite him to something like this, and he paused briefly. I knew he didn't have any plans to make excuses, so I was interested in hearing what possible objections he might have. "You know, that sounds like fun actually. What time are you gonna go?" "Sooner the better," I responded. I sent Gary the pin on Google Maps to meet me across town in 30 minutes. I hung up the phone and got ready for fun and potentially mind-provoking geocache hunt with a work friend. I would normally do something like this alone, but I wanted to venture outside of my comfort zone. Try to make more friends even though if it's a coworker I already knew. I went to the bathroom, put on a warm coat and grabbed a flashlight and debated whether or not to bring my gun. The only concern was that I didn't have a conceal permit, and I didn't want to make Gary uneasy by bringing an unnecessary weapon to a fun outing. I grabbed an energy drink before heading out and drove across town. I had the address, but I didn't know where exactly it was. I began to feel embarrassed the more remote the route began to take me. I didn't want Gary to think that I was some kind of creep trying to lure him out in the middle of nowhere. I finally arrived at the old industrial park when the sun was slowly making its descent for the night. I saw Gary smiling wide as he exited his car in what appeared to be an abandoned lot. There were a few operating facilities a block or two away, but the location for this geocache appeared to be in an old warehouse. "Hey boss man," Gary said as he closed his door while approaching me. "Thanks for the invite. Had nothing better to do." I smiled as I locked my truck. "Yeah, glad you can make it. Hopefully we can figure this one out before it gets too dark." I pulled up the app, which, once I accepted the geocache, I was given the first clue, which read, "To find the second clue, you will need a bright idea to help you." I was pretty good at riddles, but this claim seemed too vague. Bright idea? What does that even mean? Gary and I looked around the old buildings that had long been abandoned to hopefully give us some context. The buildings we stood next to had a rusted metal exterior. Graffiti-covered parts, but none of which were usually in regards to our clue. The door to the building remained bare, save for some chipped paint on the door, barely made out the words, Fulton Electrical, with the insignia of a light bulb above. Bright idea. Light bulb, I said while pointing to the door. Gary nodded with excitement as I turned on my flashlight and made our way over to the door. The door was missing a handle and a small hole took its place. A firm push on the door gave way about 2 feet, but nothing more. Gary and I squeezed in single file, entering the building in hopes of finding our second clue. The facility was mostly empty, save for a handful of rusted pieces of furniture. A metal desk sat upright upon entering. I walked over to it and sure enough, sitting on the desk was a piece of scrap metal weighing down a piece of paper with the next clue. I handed the flashlight to Gary, seeing that I wanted to share the fun. "Hey, I found it. You read this one." Gary walked over to the paper, the flashlight illuminating a small cone of light in the building. the faintest rays of sun streaming in behind us in the open door. Gary stuttered at first. Reading was clearly difficult for him. The way to the treasure you must go, find the path that leads below. Gary handed me a flashlight. Path below. Must be a basement or a cellar here. We waited for a few moments by the door, the light outside slowly fading. For once I was beginning to feel an unease crawl over me. Stuff like this normally didn't bother me, but something about this building radiated negative energy that almost seemed familiar. Well, should we go in further? Gary asked as I stalled by the door. Yeah, let's do it. We ventured in deeper to the building, leaving the small safe haven by the door. Inside, the building opened up after walking through a doorless doorway, leading into what I assume once housed heavy equipment. Rubble and graffiti spread across the building. My concern for unwanted inhabitants slowly festered in my mind. I should have brought my gun, I whispered. I was relieved that I invited Gary to tag along on this one. Something about this place brought the worst out of me. I followed Gary as we inspected the facility. After carefully inspecting the main floor, we eventually found a stairway that led to the basement. I froze in my tracks as I read some graffiti that laid above the doorway. "It waits," it said in a black sloppy spray paint. "It waits," I whispered. "Where have I heard that?" I asked, racking my brain for its significance. "I've heard that before, recently too." Gary smiled at my discomfort. Come on, it's just goth teens that do this kind of stuff to scare people away. We're so close." No. Something about this is wrong, but I don't know what it is. I have a feeling that something's down there. Gary's smile slowly faded. "Hey, you don't have to come down. I can find it. I'll bring you your flashlight back to work tomorrow. Just head on back home and I'll call you if I find anything. Here, I'll walk you to the door." Gary left the entrance to the basement and I slowly followed behind. I was worried about taking my eyes off the basement. I was worried that something was going to come out and grab me if I had. Had it not been for Gary pushing me, I couldn't say how long I would have been there. We made our way back to the door we left open, and it was now dark outside. The soft chirps of nightlife could be heard off a ways away. Surprisingly enough, the old lamppost outside in the courtyard area glowed a dull orange, casting shadows onto our cars. "I don't think you should go in that basement alone," I said, mainly out of caution for Gary. I would feel bad if I got him involved in this cache for him to get hurt alone in that basement. "Oh, I'll be quick. I'll just take a quick peek, really. We should come back tomorrow after work if you're free," he recommended. "We'll see," I said as I jumped into my truck and pulled out of the parking lot. Gary watched me as I left the area. My ease and relief became almost instant having left that building. I went home and ordered a pizza. For once I selected something other than horror to watch. Even though I was glad to have left, I still wondered about Gary in that basement. I felt good about today. Work was fine and Dr. Wilcox gave me some solid advice. I was able to step out of my comfort zone for once. I had a few beers and went to bed early. I found myself in a dark room. I don't remember how I got there or why I was there, but I noticed a light on the ground a ways away. The overwhelming fear of dread began to rise. The light was coming from a flashlight that seemed to be resting on the ground. The closer I got, the more I could hear a soft sobbing coming from one of the far corners of the room. I shuffled over slowly to pick up the light. "Hello?" I announced as I hesitantly shined the light. I could hear the soft sobs slowly turn into cries, and I shined the light to reveal a woman standing in the far corner of the room. Her hair seemed to be disheveled and matted. Her clothes were dirty and torn. I began to fear what I was witnessing, but I somehow was drawn to her. I couldn't stop moving towards her. To my surprise, I had managed the courage to muster a question that quivered as I spoke. Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped. She then stood upright, but faced away from me. Her arms were bleeding and covered in scars. She slowly turned, revealing a vaguely familiar face. Her eyes were white and the flesh of her face was rotten and pulled tightly over jagged bones that lined her face. She looked at me and cocked her head to the side. She whispered, "It was meant for you." Terror filled my body as fear overcame all of my senses. I could see movement behind her. Something large and pale began coming closer within the shadows. I shined my light towards it in its direction, but before I could make out what it was, I shot up in bed again. This time it was morning when I woke, well past the time I needed to get up. Luckily, my shift at the gas station was in the afternoon, so I had a couple of hours to kill. My fragmented dream seemed to progress in a very curious way, almost as if it made sense, but a few pieces were missing. This was the first time I had recognized her face. Before, it was too disfigured and scarred for me to make a connection, but last night I got a good enough look before something else entered the dream. The overwhelming dread lingered much longer this time. Being awake slowly dissipated the feelings, but this time was different. A haunting aura seemed to overcome me as I stood up and got ready for the day. Fridays were busy days at work, and I used the term busy loosely. I just had more business than usual that day. All perfectly capable to handle on my own, but thankfully I had a good enough team to spread it across our staff. I left my dark room and turned on all the lights in my apartment. I was trying to solve the mystery of the nightmares and the reoccurring woman in my dreams as I made breakfast. I had seen that face before, but I wasn't completely positive where. I scratched my head where one of the scars from my car crash from years ago still remained. I don't really remember much before that. Memories of friends and family had either been greatly blurred or removed from my mind altogether. I was certain that this woman was somehow part of my life before, but there was no way to know for sure. I got ready for work, the sense of unease still gripping me firmly. My anxiety seemed to be unmovable despite my best efforts to clear my mind. Before leaving, I checked the front door, and for the first time in weeks, the door was free from the wretched paper. As slight of a relief as it was, I felt relieved to see my door bare for once. I left for work, making sure I would get there early enough to try to calm down before having to work my shift. The cool morning was beginning to grow warm. It had rained last night. Small puddles could be still seen as I walked out to my truck. The air was clean and crisp. Surprisingly enough, my drive to work alleviated most of my apprehension, but not completely. I arrived at work seeing a few cars pumping gas as I parked in the back. I saw Jessica's beater car next to the dumpster, but I didn't see Gary's. Normally I had 2 people scheduled for Friday's rush, but it appeared that there was only one here. I withheld judgment before walking in to confirm that Gary was in fact not here. Jessica sat behind the counter, attending to a customer as I walked in. Thankfully, most of the foot traffic at the gas station was outside. "Where's Gary?" I asked once the customer left the store. Jessica rolled her eyes. "You tell me. He was supposed to open today." I checked my phone just in case I'd missed a call or text from him, but I didn't have any notifications. At this point, he was several hours late, which was unusual. He was by far my most punctual employee, so for him to do this was really out of character. A slight tingle of anxiety began to tickle the back of my neck. A brief thought of suspicion crawled quickly to the forefront of my mind. The last time I'd seen or heard from him was yesterday. It hadn't been that long ago, so I tried to rationalize where he could be or what had happened. Before I could call him, a small rush of customers came in, forcing me to help Jessica help up front. This caused me to get distracted. The logistics of the store became a primary focus rather than my top employee no call, no showing. I spent the rest of the afternoon having to cover for Gary, as I would try calling him every couple of hours to check in on him. But as I feared, he didn't answer. I sent him a text to see how he was doing and to call me when he was available. As frustrating as it was, the added work and distraction was much needed on my end. I thanked Jessica as she left her shift, and I took Gary's as I waited for the night shift to come in. The busy Friday was beginning to slow down. Night shift showed up on time and was surprised to still see me at the gas station. I told him I had to cover, which wasn't a big deal. I left the gas station around 8. The bright lights of the storefront and the pumping area partially illuminated the rear parking as I walked back checking my phone. I had a few notifications, but none of them were from Gary. I was tempted to go by his place to check in on him, but that would have just seemed creepy. He'll reach out to me if he needs me, I thought. I put my phone away while reflecting on today's events. I half expected to see a paper on my truck's windshield, but it sat untouched. It was Friday night. I didn't have any plans, but I was curious about Gary, as well as where we sat for that geocache. I tried contacting him again, but still no reply. I got in my truck and pondered my weekend plans as I drove home. My mind had pushed off the unease from this morning, and I planned on drinking most of my consciousness away in order to deal with my anxiety. I pulled into my complex parking lot and got ready to go in, when a sinister idea crept into my mind. I should go drive by that building to see if Gary's still there. He might not have even left. I shook my head and got out of my truck. Gary's a big boy. I can worry about him on Monday. I went inside and got my keys ready when I saw a disheartening sight on my door. It was another paper with a symbol, but underneath it were words written in barely legible writing. It should have been you. I looked around in hopes of perhaps catching a glimpse of whoever placed this here, but my hallway was empty. It was the same phrase that the woman said in my dreams. What should have been me? My mind began to think the worst. I think something happened to Gary that was intended for me. I went inside my apartment, went straight into my room and grabbed my gun on the nightstand. I fished around my apartment for another flashlight since Gary had my good one. I began to worry as I concealed the pistol in my pocket and walked briskly out to my truck. It was around 9 o'clock at this point. Most of the traffic in town had died down to a slow crawl, with only a handful of vehicles on the road. The 30-minute drive was quicker than I wanted. I arrived at the location where Gary and I had met earlier, and my suspicions were confirmed. Out front sat Gary's car. I was engulfed with a wave of dread. Something had clearly happened to him. My thoughts were overwhelmed with paranoia. I checked my gun and made sure it was loaded. Whoever was responsible for the symbols and whatever happened to Gary was probably inside. I got out and walked over slowly to the door. It was still ajar from yesterday. I turned on my flashlight and went inside. I pulled my gun out and held it by my side in the off chance that I needed to use it. I fumbled my way to the back of the building where the basement was and paused. I shined my light down the stairs, which made my stomach turn. I worked my way down slowly, unsure of what I was going to find. I was hoping I wouldn't find anything, but I knew deep down that something of malicious intent remained here. Once at the bottom of the stairs, I shined my light around to see the basement filled with garbage and debris. A new level of horror began to build in my mind. A strong smell of decay and mold began to fester the further I went into the darkness. I felt an overwhelming sense of horror build, not just for myself but for Gary. What happened to him? And was he even down here? I considered calling out to him, but my mind wouldn't allow me. My primal senses were on high alert. Although I was under the impression this building was unused for many years, my mind told me that something awful awaited for me in the depths of this basement. I pressed forward in hope of finding any signs of Gary, but at the same time I hope I didn't. My footsteps crunched broken glass of beer bottles and other debris, loudly announcing my presence to those that were around to hear it. I then shined my light a ways away on what appeared to be a plastic tarp that hung covering what looked like a doorway. I froze. There was a good chance that there was something back there that I didn't want to see. I stood in the hallway weighing my options. Fearing that Gary had been lured into some kind of sinister trap, I gripped my gun and slowly approached, hoping that my footsteps would soften the slower I went. I reached the tarp. It was one of those heavy, opaque ones that you couldn't quite see through all the way. I shined my light down and pressed on the tarp. It made a soft ruffling noise as I entered the room. It was much less sturdy, but the light reflected something on the floor in the middle of the room. I could see off in the room my old flashlight I let Gary borrow, but I saw no sign of him. My heart began to beat faster as I inched my way towards the center of the room. The smell hit me much harder. I could see that in the center of the floor appeared to be some kind of design, with what looked like roadkill placed at coordinated intervals. My mind raced so quickly that it took me a moment to recognize what I was looking at. Drawn on the concrete floor was the same design as the symbol that had been placed on my door for the last couple of weeks. I lifted my gun and searched the room frantically, unsure of what I was now involved with. For a brief moment, I saw a figure standing in the far corner of the room, which caused me to jump. Out of reaction, my grip had tightened on the trigger, and I fired the gun on accident. A puff of dust came from where the bullet had hit on the wall, and a ringing in my ears quickly overwhelmed me. I shined the light in the corner to see that the figure didn't move. I walked over slowly as the figure was facing the wall, but I soon recognized it as Gary. He was standing upright, but his head was twisted back, as if he was staring at the ceiling above him. I walked over to him quickly, but my brief excitement quickly turned to concern. It wasn't until I walked up to him and I looked at him did I realize that something awful had happened. His mouth and eyes were open, but he looked lifeless. A strange dark liquid seemed to have came from his open eyes, as if he was weeping this dark sludge. "Gary," I whispered. It was clear at this point that Gary's body was nothing more than a hollow shell. Something had happened here, and I'm not sure I could ever understand. Something truly horrific that I have yet to have encountered in my life. It was weird seeing him stand lifeless like this. At this point, I realized that things were worse than I had thought. I had reached a new height of terror as my mind began to comprehend whatever did this was probably here that night. And what was worse, it was probably still here. Before I could move, I heard a movement coming from beyond the tarp, coming this way. I could hear the distant glass being stepped on and getting louder, as well as another sound accompanying it. It didn't take long for me to realize it was the sound of something being dragged behind those footsteps. Unsure of what to do, I moved away from Gary and stood against the wall near the opening of the tarp. I got my gun ready, hoping that just threatening whoever came in here would be enough. I turned off my flashlight and waited for whoever it was to come in. I knew that they must have heard my gunshot, but they didn't know where I was. My eyes strained for a beam of someone's flashlight to come into view, but it never did. The footsteps got louder, and I finally realized that whoever was down here was not using a flashlight. They were navigating the basement in the dark. Something wasn't right. No person could move around down here with all the garbage by pure memory. The basement was pitch black. There was no way anyone could see without the aid of some kind of light. My heart skipped a beat when I heard the tarp being moved as someone walked through it. I lifted my gun to the noise and held my breath. The dragging sound continued, but I then began to hear strange gurgling and clicks. My adrenaline was now flowing unrestricted in my veins. A sense of heightened awareness began to reveal that I was in the presence of something I've never encountered before. I wasn't sure what it was dragging, but I assumed the worst. The noise thankfully continued past me and over into the corner where what remained of Gary stood. I lifted my flashlight, which was off, and anticipated confronting whoever was down here. I had to ready myself that I might even need to shoot them if necessary. I aimed the flashlight where I thought the person was, but before I could turn it on, a strange slurping sound could be heard. I could hear liquids being spilled, and the terrifying sounds continued. In a panic, I turned on the flashlight. My mind took a couple of seconds to process what I was seeing, but I couldn't grasp it. A second body had been placed next to Gary's, but standing in front of it was the tallest person I'd ever seen. Long strands of hair came off of its bald head. It was easily 8 feet tall, but that wasn't the startling part. Whoever this person or thing was had inserted the whole person's head into its mouth. My light flashed over the unholy sight of this thing, sucking out the life of this poor person in its grasp. The humanoid creature slowly removed the person's head from its mouth, all the while a black liquid spilled onto the concrete floor. The thing looked at me. Fear told me that my fate was the same as Gary's, that even the gun I held was useless against this beast. In a surge of adrenaline and hope, I took off through the tarp and out of the room. I stumbled through the basement, my footing unsure with each step. I couldn't run fast enough. I was constantly fighting to gain my balance. I got halfway through the basement when I heard an unsettling screech. It was so loud that I wasn't sure how close it was to me. The movement behind me was quickening, and I knew I had to take a stand, that I had to try to kill or at least injure it, enough for it to leave me alone. I turned to fend off my pursuer, but it was so fast. It was less than 10 yards away and closing in quick. I fired my gun rapidly, hoping at least one of the bullets would hit the monster. But the monster kept coming. Dr. Wilcox sat in his office and looked at his watch. He was more concerned than disappointed as he waited. Hayden had never missed an appointment. After the 20-minute grace period, Dr. Wilcox filed the session as a no-call, no-show. Hayden was his last appointment for the day, which, although he was concerned, he was glad to go home early. Dr. Wilcox left the office and put his work out of his mind. He drove home to his farm about 40 minutes away, into the country. He didn't mind the commute seeing as he had started the clinic years ago, and within the last 5 years, he had inherited his father's estate. The farm had a gate at the bottom of the driveway, which sat a single police car. Wilcox rubbed his brow to alleviate the growing stress as an officer got out as he approached. Wilcox rolled down his window. "Afternoon, officer," he said with the most subtle annoyance in his tone. "Hello, doctor. Mind if I ask you a couple of questions about one of your patients?" Wilcox parked his car. "As a matter of fact, I do. I can't discuss anything about my patients, especially off the clock." The officer nodded. "I know. I was just seeing the last time you saw Hayden Reese. He's been missing for the last couple of days." Wilcox's demeanor had shifted. Rather than being standoffish, the news had brought out an odd sense of concern. He fumbled with his words as he was processing the information, and was still trying to be confidential about his patient. "I hadn't seen him this week. That's all I can share." The officer nodded. "All right. Have a good day, Doc." The officer handed him his card, then got into his cruiser, but he didn't leave. Wilcox pulled ahead and punched the gate code. The rest of the evening had a somber air about it. Not only had a troubling patient not shown up, but he was also reported missing for a couple of days now. Wilcox could not help but try to remember the last session with Hayden. He pulled up his session notes he kept on his laptop, but nothing really popped out at him. Bad dreams, don't be alone, do a geocache with a friend. Nothing showed signs of concern. Geocache, what was that again? He mumbled to himself. He googled the name and up popped a couple of definitions as well as several websites and videos of people solving clues. Huh. Wilcox then closed his computer and did his best to put all that aside to enjoy his evening. He went about his evening routine of checking random emails and watching a variety of game shows with his dinner. Wilcox took his evening medicine with a small sip of wine to help boost the effects, which he would never advise anyone else to do. That night, dreams had plagued him for the first time in a while. Images of a dark basement, a small gathering of people entered his mind in a diluted fashion. Symbols on the walls and floor were illuminated. A feeling of dread slowly builds as loud footsteps approached from in the darkness. Before whatever approached, an image of a scarred man pointing to an open metal door. The man's face was grotesque and unrecognizable, as his eyes and mouth were slowly spewing a dark liquid. He pointed to the door and whispered, "Don't let it out." Wilcox opened his eyes, the effects of the drug still inflicting their side effects with full force. On his nightstand, he grabbed his dream journal and wrote, "Open door, and don't let it out." He then closed his eyes again, unaware of what he had just scribbled, and fell asleep. Friday morning, he awoke to the sound of the alarm on his phone. The nightmare he had endured only hours ago had faded from his drug-induced slumber, but what did remain were the cryptic messages he had written in his dream journal. Wilcox made sure to give himself plenty of time in the morning in order to let the side effects wear off. He checked his phone and emails, but noticed that his journal was left open. He hadn't dreamed in months, or at least any that he could remember. He was surprised to see that he had written words, "Open door," and "Don't let it out." The words meant nothing to him. He was more surprised to see that he'd even written anything at all than the messages itself. He got ready for work, taking his time to make sure he had cleared his head before getting into his car. The business card of Officer Fielding sat in the cup holder of his Lexus. He arrived at the office early like he always did. He pulled out his laptop and got ready for the day. Hayden's file tab was still open, as well as the geocache tab. Instead of closing the tabs, he clicked on them again and reread the contents. The file wasn't terribly in detail, but the more he read it, the more he began to recall his dream last night. Hayden's account of the woman were very similar to what he experienced, although he couldn't make out the gender of the scarred figure. He kept reading, getting more involved with the unexplainable disappearance when his first patient came in for the day. He put aside his research, but it never fully left his mind. The day went by surprisingly slow, although it was a half day for Wilcox. He finally went to his laptop and started closing the tabs when he saw a geocache tab still open. He saw in one of the search results from all the geocaches in the area, which only resulted in one across town. What are the odds, he thought. Instead of getting lunch and heading home, Dr. Wilcox drove across town out of pure curiosity and nothing more. As he got closer to the location, flashes of the nightmare slowly came to the forefront of his mind. Wilcox struggled with his own demons, but this was something else. Something much stronger that was affecting his mental focus. He arrived at the industrial park and saw the two vehicles parked out front. He was aware of this part of town, but always thought it had been deserted. He glanced at the door and felt a strong sensation of deja vu that he'd ever felt. Unsure of what to do, Wilcox then picked up the business card of Officer Fields and gave him a quick call. He answered in 2 rings. "Officer Fields." "Hey, this is Dr. Wilcox. I spoke to you yesterday about my patient, Hayden." Fields took a moment but remembered. "Ah, yes, hey." "So, I think I might have something for you," Wilcox said. "I'm down at the old industrial park, and I think my patient was here at one point. I can't be sure. There's 2 cars parked here, and maybe one of them is his. I don't know, I'm just trying to help." "Okay, yeah, thank you. I can be over in about 20 minutes if you don't mind hanging tight, and I can run the plates. I appreciate your help on this." Wilcox hung up and waited in his car for the officer to show up. During that time, he began to doubt if this was even worth a call to the police. There was a good chance that all of this was just circumstantial, and that Hayden was simply lost out in the woods or something. Field showed up within the time frame agreed upon and exited the cruiser. "Thanks for the call. I'll run these plates and maybe check out what's inside the warehouse. You're welcome to hang around if you want." Wilcox smiled. "Thanks, but I should probably get going." Officer Fields wrote down the plate numbers and went back to his cruiser while Wilcox hopped into his car. Wilcox began pulling out when Fields waved him down, and he stopped. "You were right. The truck is registered to a Hayden Reese," Fields yelled. Wilcox's heart dropped. He parked his car again and got out. "Is it okay if I check the place out with you?" Fields nodded. Sure thing. The two entered the building while speaking softly about Hayden. Wilcox was telling him that Hayden was looking for clues for this silly game they play online. Fields led the way while shining a flashlight around the building. The two looked for any signs that might explain where he might be. The light from outside helped very little in illuminating the building through the old windows and holes in the wall. Upon inspecting the main floor, Fields made a startling discovery in one of the old offices. A dark liquid had pooled in one of the corners, and smears led out of the room. "What is that?" he exclaimed, unsure of what any of this could have been. The marks were still fresh as they held a moisture to it. The two men knew something was off. Fields called in on his radio. "Sector 29, this is Fields. I'm with Dr. Wilcox in the old electrical office off James Street. Please send backup to this location." His radio buzzed back almost immediately with confirmation. Fields then unholstered his pistol and followed the drag marks while shining the light on the ground. "What could this be, Doc? Blood doesn't look like this, does it? It's too dark. It's like an oil or something." "I'm not sure," Wilcox responded as the two followed the trail that eventually led to the basement. "Ah, shit," Fields whispered. "That's terrifying." The two men briefly shared a smile in agreement of the situation. "Let's wait for backup." The two men waited outside while two more cruisers pulled up. The four other officers approached Fields while he gave them a brief of the situation. "We got something weird going on here. My guy is missing for a week or so and his truck is parked out front. This is his psych who will be tagging along with us. We checked out the inside and saw signs of a potential struggle, but we're not sure. All the evidence leads to the basement." The four officers then geared up with weapons from their cruisers and met back outside the front door. Fields led the way while Wilcox took safety in the back of the pack. He led them straight to the basement stairs and all six of them quickly descended into the darkness below. A stench of various smells began to amplify the further they went. The five officers began sweeping the basement in tactical formation. They had clearly practiced this before. They navigated through the garbage, but more troubling signs could be seen ahead. More dark marks with more smears of that liquid led to the back room where the opaque tarp stood, separating the half-dozen men that were unsure of what stood on the other side. Everyone's focus was on the tarp. Silence surrounded them as they approached the tarp with apprehension. Despite being with five highly trained policemen, Wilcox was afraid. He was unsure of what horrors laid in wait just beyond the thin piece of plastic. The men pushed through, one by one, and slowly did the group come to see what waited for them on the other side. At first, they were startled. About a dozen people stood all facing away. The officers were confused as to why so many people were just standing like this in the dark basement. Wilcox approached one of them and made a terrifying discovery. Much like his dream, this figure's face was covered in scars. Their eyes were white, while thick streams of liquid were smeared down its face. The person's mouth was wide, as if screaming in pain, but stood lifeless. This person is dead. They all are. All 15 corpses stood in the same position, all of which stood upright with their necks snapped, causing their heads to face the ceiling directly. Oh my gosh. The cement floor was covered in the dark liquid. The officers shined their lights around in panic, unsure of who or what was responsible for such carnage. They did their best to secure the room by checking all the bodies and seeing that the only way in was through that tarp. The officers called for backup, as well as medical aid. Wilcox and Field briefly conversed. "Thanks for the tip on this," Field said, almost remorseful of being the one to make the discovery. "I hope we can get to the bottom of this. I gotta get going. I shouldn't have even been here to begin with." Fields and Wilcox walked out of the room and made their way down the disheveled hallway. The dark basement seemed more eerie now that they had found the contorted corpses with the dark liquid coming from their eyes and mouth. As they walked, both men heard what sounded like shifting in the dark corner of the basement. Their flashlights could only reach so far, leaving a good portion of the basement unviewed. Head back up and I'll have the other officers clear the rest of the basement with me. I'll call you if we can identify Hayden. Wilcox agreed and quickly made his way up the stairs. He was relieved to leave that hellhole. Once outside, a weight had been lifted from his soul. Not only did he help make serious progress in finding Hayden, but finally leaving that basement brightened his outlook. Despite being relieved, he was still haunted by the horrible images of those bodies. The terrible smell of the black liquid and the mystery behind everything still occupied his mind. The drive home would have been pleasant had it not been for the recent memories still flashing in his mind. He tried to listen to music, but it was just noise to him. It was becoming more clear that this was affecting him more than he originally thought. By the time he got home, it was 3 o'clock. Wilcox was still trying to wrap his mind around what he had witnessed only less than an hour ago. He knew deep down that Hayden was probably amongst the group of bodies that still stood erect with their necks twisted and scarred faces. What was weird about all of this is that most of what he had seen had been revealed to him in a drug-induced dream the night prior. That basement had conjured feelings of deep terror and violence. Whoever was responsible was clearly no longer human, but some psychopath that was unable to feel. Wilcox poured himself some wine to help take the edge off. The evening came and his nerves had finally subsided with the help of distraction and alcohol. The feelings of disgust still hung over him. It was around 8 o'clock when Wilcox took his concoction of medicine. Sleep would for sure help him remedy the horrors that he had witnessed that day. He took a couple of extra sips of his wine that he normally did, considering that he didn't have work tomorrow. As he was getting ready for bed, his phone rang. It was Officer Fields. He sighed and let his phone ring to voicemail. He was in no state of mind to hear what bad news he had to offer, especially at this late hour. He got into bed and felt the drugs kick in quickly. He was overwhelmed by not only the speeds of the effects, but also the strength. His visions had faded to black, but eventually found himself standing in that horrible basement. He could smell the thick stench of the black liquid. He could feel the cold that nipped at his skin. His spine tingled with anxiety as he looked around with the dim flashlight that he had. A brief sense of relief washed over him as he saw that Fields and the other officers were standing with him, but not for long. Their faces were all scarred. Their necks had been snapped and their eyes were milky white, much like the victims that they'd found. Shuffling could be heard beyond the darkness. Fields snapped his neck back down to face Wilcox, but his head was still misaligned. Fields grumbled something from his lifeless mouth that instantly cut to his core. "None of us are safe." Wilcox began to sweat out of fear. He could hear within the darkness something horrid coming closer. The other officers slowly tilted their heads back down and looked at Wilcox with empty stares. "He's at the door. He's at the door," they groaned. They continued to chant the phrase as a figure in the shadows slowly came into view. It stood upright, but the height was beyond anything a human could manage. It approached as if it was afraid of the light, but was slowly becoming more and more confident. "Who's there?" he cried, in hopes of some kind of intelligent response, but they came closer. The chanting from the dead officers got louder. "He's at the door! He's at the door!" The figure was now close enough that the flashlight began to reveal some more details. Its many rows of teeth, the blood-red eyes filled with hatred and carnage, the large hands that held long bony fingers with sharp nails on the ends. The chanting now became shouts as Wilcox froze in place. The creature was now in full view. Its hideous appearance now in full display to Wilcox's horror. This was no mere man or creature. This was a monster. The result of conjuring evil by a wicked power. The monster reached for Wilcox, its gnarled hand inches away from Wilcox when he shot out of bed. He was breathing heavily. His bed was covered in sweat. He was still foggy from the medicine still in his system. He felt mostly numb, but the dream was so powerful, he felt dread as well. He checked the time and saw it was 4 in the morning. He had 7 missed calls from Field. Wilcox tried to catch his breath as he grabbed his dream journal. As he was writing, he heard a sound downstairs at his door. He got out of bed and froze. He could hear the handle jingling frantically and occasional bumps against the door. He was unsure if he locked the door last night. So much had happened that it was likely that he had forgotten. To his horror, he had heard the handle click and slowly creaked open the door.